So this lesson is going to break down specifically what it means to add and subtract decimals, how we add or subtract decimals, and some of those things that we really need to consider when we want to add or subtract decimals. So let's go back to the example that was left at the end of the preview. We've color-coded place value columns here so that we can easily see what we need to add together and what represents the same thing. In this case, the greens represent the thousands, the orange columns represent the hundreds, the blue columns represent the tens, red columns represent the ones, purple the tenths, and yellow the hundredths. And so what we need to make sure we know and make sure we understand is that anytime that we add or subtract any kind of number, whole numbers, decimals, combinations like these are that have whole number and decimal parts, we want to make sure we add together values from the same place value. So we want to add the ones to the ones, the tens to the tens, the hundreds to the hundreds, the thousandths to the thousandths, the billions to the billions, and etc. It's very important that we only add together, or when we're subtracting, line up in vertical columns those place values that are identical. So let's take a look at an example. If you're walking through a store and you find a TV that's available for $624.73, and a PlayStation 3 it's available for $292.26. Now you want to find out how much both of them cost as a matter of saying, can I buy both of these? Can I not buy both of these? You want to find out what their total cost is. So you're going to add together their two costs. Now, the question that comes up immediately when you're adding together costs is, how do we line up the values to represent place values to make sure that we're only adding ones to ones, tens to tens, etc. Now, when we're using whole numbers, and just whole numbers, it becomes easier, because if we have something like 350 and 75, we can just make sure that the farthest right-hand column is lined up with the farthest right-hand column. Because when we're talking about whole numbers, the farthest right-hand column is the ones. We have to represent something in the ones column every time we talk about whole numbers. It may be a 0 like it is here in 350, but we have to represent the one column somehow. And that's not necessarily true anytime that we're talking about decimals. In this case, it's going to be, because as you can see with our color-coded place values, that the hundreds, the tens, the ones, the tenths, the hundredths all have the same color. So when we're looking at this, we can line up the right-handmost place values here. And so just like we would with adding and subtracting any whole numbers, we start from the lowest place value, the one at the farthest right-hand side. In whole numbers, it's ones. In this case, it happens to be the hundredths, which are coded in yellow, and we add vertically down, because if we line them up correctly, then our vertical columns will represent the same place value. So 3 plus 6 here in this case is 9, 7 plus 2 is 9. We have the decimal point. The decimal point gets carried down in the exact same place because it represents the transition from whole numbers to parts of numbers. And then moving on, 6 in the ones. We have an 11 for the tens, so we add the 1 to the hundreds place and add that up. It becomes $916.99 altogether. So looking at this, using the colored columns as we did for whole numbers to make sure that we have our columns lined up, we get to the idea that to add or subtract decimals, we add or subtract identical place values the same way that we would add or subtract whole numbers. The only difference now is that we have to make sure that we have lined up our numbers correctly, that we can easily and correctly add together numbers of the same place value. So in this case, I've highlighted the decimal points because the decimal points represent that transition. There is only one place in the entire place value system where we transition from a whole number to a part of a number, from ones to tenths, from talking about millions to talking about billionths, and that is at the decimal point. So the decimal point is going to be the marker that we look for to make sure that we've lined up the place values. That is, we must line up the decimal point and add enough zeros to the right. Now let's take a look at an example of that specifically, and then I'll send you off to look at it before. But you know what? See what you can do with these two here. Keep in mind and notice that there are more place values to the right of the decimal point in some of these numbers than there are in others. And we have to line up the decimal points for it. So go ahead and take a look at these two examples. Line up the decimal points. Add zeros where you think they may need to be added before we get to what that actually is. Pause the video and then come back and we'll take a look at the answers for these. So in the left-hand column, we have 327 and 10/100ths plus 25 and 6/10ths. Now we know that we need to line up place value columns, and how we do that is by lining up the decimal point, because that is where the transition takes place. So we have 327 and 25.6, where our decimal point has to go here. So now, keeping the columns lined up, 25.6. Now, if you remember, I said you might have to add a 0 to the right of the decimal point, and this is where you have to add that 0. So going through, now just adding down through place value columns, 0 plus 0 is 0. 1 plus 6 is 7. 7 plus 5 is 12. So we drop the 2 there and add a 1 to the next column, because 12 ones represents 2 ones and a new 10. So 1 plus 2 is 5 tens. And still just 300s because we have nothing else to add there. So what we've gotten is that 327 and 10/100ths plus 25 and 6/10ths is 352 and 70/100ths. Now if we do the same thing over on the left-hand side, where we have 197 and 35/100ths plus 45 and 87/1000ths, we can see that we need to add a place value marker placeholder in the top number, in the 197 and 35/100ths, to represent that there are 0 thousandths there. And again, now that we've done this, all of our place value columns are lined up, and we're guaranteed for that because our decimal points are lined up. And now we've got 7 plus 0 is 7, 13, add a 1, 4, decimal point 12, add 1 more to here, becomes 14, add 1 more to the hundreds, and becomes 242 and 437 thousandths. The last thing I'll ask you to do is pause the video once again, and on the left-hand problem, 327 and 10/100ths plus 25 and 6/10ths, we want to change that now to a subtraction problem. Same numbers, just now talking subtraction instead. So go ahead and pause the video, work on that as a subtraction problem, come back, we'll look at the answer. Well, you should have lined up the place value columns exactly as you had before. 327 and 10/100ths minus 25 and 6/10ths. Now in this column we do need, in this case, we do need to add the 0 again to make sure we have complete columns all the way out through the lowest decimal place. 0 minus 0 is 0. Reviewing now, if you're not familiar with this, you can brush up on your subtraction and borrowing, but we need to borrow from the ones. You can turn one of those ones into 10/10ths, because 1 1 represents 10/10ths the same way as 1 10 represents 10 1s. So now 11 minus 6 is 5, 1, 0, and 3. So 327 and 10/100ths minus 25 and 6/10ths is the same as 301 and 5/10ths. So once again, to add or subtract decimals, the most important thing that we have is to line up the decimal points, because the decimal points represent that transition from whole numbers to parts of numbers. And since that transition takes place only in one place in our entire place value system, if we line up those decimal points, we're guaranteed to the left and to the right of the decimal point that all of our place values are lined up correctly.